There's a number that appears before every major war in modern history. Not army size, not military budgets, not alliance treaties. Debt to GDP ratios. When nations reach a certain level of debt relative to their economic output, war becomes not just likely, but mathematically inevitable. Before World War I, the major powers had debt to GDP ratios averaging 25-30%. Before World War II, those same nations averaged 40-50%. Today, in 2025, developed nations average over 100%. The United States sits at 120%, Japan at 260%, some European nations over 150%. These aren't just numbers on a spreadsheet, they're warning signals. Because when debt reaches unsustainable levels, governments face an impossible choice: default and collapse, or find a way to eliminate the debt entirely. And throughout history, there's only been one method that works consistently, quickly, and completely: war. Total war restructures everything. Debt gets forgiven, repudiated, or inflated away. Creditor nations get destroyed. New economic orders emerge from the ashes. It's not coincidence that massive debt crises precede global conflicts. It's cause and effect. And right now, global debt levels are higher than they've ever been in human history. The pattern is screaming. The only question is timing. There's an economic law that governments don't want you to understand. When sovereign debt reaches certain levels relative to a nation's economic output, war becomes mathematically inevitable. Not probable, inevitable. Because at extreme debt levels, governments face only three options: default and trigger economic collapse, continue borrowing until the currency becomes worthless, or eliminate the debt entirely through the one mechanism that has worked throughout history: war. Here's how the debt trap works. Nations borrow to fund military expansion, social programs, infrastructure, or economic stimulus. Initially, this appears sustainable. The economy grows, tax revenues increase, debt can be serviced, but government spending has a ratchet effect. Programs expand, commitments multiply, military costs escalate, and once populations expect certain benefits, cutting them becomes politically impossible. So borrowing accelerates. Debt to GDP ratios climb from 20% to 30, then 50, then beyond. At first, creditors remain confident. The nation is powerful. The economy is strong. But there's a mathematical breaking point. When debt service consumes too much of government revenue, when debt to GDP ratios exceed the economy's growth rate permanently, the mathematics become impossible. You cannot borrow your way out of debt indefinitely. Modern economists call this debt sustainability. There's a threshold, usually around 60 to 90% debt to GDP, where normal economic growth can no longer service the obligations. Beyond that point, you need extraordinary measures: massive austerity that destroys the economy, currency debasement that destroys savings, or debt elimination through the ultimate extraordinary measure: war resets everything. Creditor nations get destroyed, their claims eliminated. Debtor nations can repudiate obligations to enemies. Currencies can be revalued or replaced entirely. Physical destruction creates massive reconstruction spending that stimulates growth. Most importantly, war provides moral justification for what would otherwise be theft. Debt forgiveness becomes patriotic duty rather than economic default. This isn't theory, it's historical fact. Every major war in the past 2 centuries has coincided with unsustainable debt levels in the primary combatants. World War I, World War II, even regional conflicts follow this pattern. When debt becomes unpayable through normal means, nations find other means. And throughout history, war has been the most effective debt elimination tool ever devised. The mechanism is brutal, but it works, which is why understanding current global debt levels isn't just academic interest, it's survival preparation. But this isn't theory. History proves it. Let's start with the first modern example. In 1914, Europe was drowning in debt that nobody wanted to acknowledge. The great powers had spent decades borrowing to fund imperial expansion, naval arms races, and growing social obligations. What appeared to be the height of civilization was actually a house of cards built on unsustainable credit. Look at the numbers. Britain's debt to GDP ratio had climbed from 15% in 1870 to 30% by 1914. France sat at 35%, Germany at 25%, Russia at 40%. These might seem modest by today's standards, but for pre-industrial economies with limited taxation systems, they represented unprecedented burdens. More critically, debt service was consuming ever larger portions of government revenue while military spending continued accelerating. The arms race made everything worse. Britain's naval expansion program required massive borrowing. Germany's fleet construction was funded through debt. France borrowed to fund railway construction and military modernization. Russia borrowed from France, which borrowed from Britain, which borrowed from its own citizens. The entire European economy had become a circular debt scheme where each nation's prosperity depended on others continuing to pay obligations they couldn't actually afford. By 1910, European governments were spending more on debt service and military preparation than on productive investment. Economic growth was slowing, while obligations accelerated. Financial analysts of the era noted the unsustainability, but political leaders insisted the system could continue indefinitely. They were wrong. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in June 1914, the immediate reaction wasn't about Serbian nationalism or Austrian honor. It was financial panic. European bond markets collapsed. Credit dried up. The interconnected debt system that had funded decades of expansion was suddenly exposed as fundamentally unstable. What followed wasn't just political miscalculation. It was economic inevitability. War allowed governments to repudiate international obligations, impose total economic controls, and restructure their entire financial systems. German bonds held by French investors became worthless overnight. Russian debts to British banks vanished with the revolution. Austrian obligations to Italian creditors disappeared with territorial occupation. The war eliminated approximately $40 billion in international debt through destruction, repudiation, and currency collapse, more efficiently than any peacetime mechanism could have achieved. By 1918, the debt levels that had seemed impossible to manage in 1914 had been wiped clean through systematic economic destruction. The pattern was established, but it would repeat, larger and more devastating, because the underlying mechanism remained unchanged. When debt becomes mathematically impossible to repay, nations find extraordinary solutions. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just end World War I, it created the economic conditions that guaranteed the next one. Germany emerged from the war crushed by debt that was mathematically impossible to repay. War reparations of 132 billion gold marks. Internal war debt of 150 billion marks. Combined obligations totaling nearly 400% of Germany's annual economic output. Think about what that means. Germany would have needed to dedicate its entire economic production for 4 years just to pay the debt, with nothing left for food, housing, or basic survival. It was economic suicide disguised as justice, and everyone knew it was impossible. French economist John Maynard Keynes resigned from the Versailles negotiations in protest, writing that the reparations would destroy Germany and destabilize Europe. He was right. Germany tried to pay anyway. The government printed money to meet reparation payments and fund basic operations. Inflation began gradually, then accelerated exponentially. By 1922, prices were doubling every few weeks. By 1923, they were doubling daily. A loaf of bread that cost 1 mark in 1919 cost 200 billion marks by November 1923. But hyperinflation wasn't incompetence. It was strategy. By destroying the currency, Germany effectively eliminated its internal debt while making reparations payments worthless. A debt of 100 billion marks became manageable when 100 billion marks wouldn't buy a newspaper. The debt problem was solved through monetary destruction. The social cost was catastrophic. Middle-class savings evaporated overnight. Pensions became worthless. Anyone holding German bonds or currency lost everything. The economic foundation of society collapsed, creating mass desperation and rage. People who had been prosperous and stable suddenly faced starvation. The psychological trauma was permanent. Into this economic chaos stepped political extremists, offering simple explanations and violent solutions. The Nazi Party's membership grew from 65,000 in 1920 to 850,000 by 1929. Not because Germans suddenly embraced fascism, but because traditional economic and political systems had been destroyed by the debt crisis. Adolf Hitler understood the pattern perfectly. Germany's debt burden made normal economic recovery impossible. Therefore, extraordinary measures became necessary. Territorial expansion could provide resources and eliminate creditor nations. War could restructure all debts and create a new economic order. What seemed like political madness was actually mathematical logic applied to an impossible debt situation. The Weimar Republic's collapse proved that debt crises don't just cause economic problems. They destroy political stability and create the conditions for extremism. Germany's collapse set the stage for something far worse. By 1939, the world's major powers were carrying debt levels that made another global conflict inevitable. The Great Depression had destroyed government revenues while forcing massive spending on unemployment relief, public works, and military rearmament. Every major nation faced the same impossible mathematics that had destroyed Germany 20 years earlier. Look at the exact numbers. Britain's debt to GDP ratio had exploded from 30% in 1914 to 180% by 1939. France sat at 90%. The United States, despite being the world's creditor during World War I, had climbed to 43%. Japan reached 70% while funding massive military expansion in China. Even more critically, these debts were compounding faster than economic growth could service them. Germany's situation was most desperate. Despite defaulting on reparations, the Nazi regime had accumulated massive internal debt financing rearmament and public works programs. By 1939, German government debt exceeded 100% of GDP, with an additional $40 billion marks in hidden military obligations. The regime was spending 37% of national income on military preparation, while unemployment benefits and social programs consumed another 20%. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. At these debt levels, normal peacetime economic activity could not generate sufficient revenue to service obligations. Every major power faced the same choice: economic collapse or extraordinary measures, and the only extraordinary measure that had ever worked was war. War offered multiple debt solutions simultaneously. Enemy assets could be seized to pay debts. International obligations could be repudiated as payments to hostile powers. Currency controls could eliminate foreign creditors' claims. Most importantly, total war economics allowed governments to control all resources, redirect production, and restructure debt on their own terms. Hitler understood this perfectly. Germany's debt made conventional economic recovery impossible, but victorious war could eliminate creditor nations entirely, while providing resources to fund the Nazi state indefinitely. France owed billions to Britain and America. If Germany conquered France, those debts vanished. If Germany controlled European resources, German debt became irrelevant. The pattern repeated globally. Japan's China campaign was funded through debt that required constant territorial expansion to sustain. Britain's empire became essential for debt service rather than profitable expansion. America's isolation ended when European debt defaults threatened to trigger domestic economic collapse. By September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the war had already become inevitable. The debt levels guaranteed it. What followed was the most effective debt elimination program in human history. The Second World War proved the pattern absolutely, but the debt levels that caused it, they're nothing compared to today. The debt levels that triggered 2 world wars look quaint compared to today's numbers. In 1939, when global conflict became inevitable, the highest debt to GDP ratio among major powers was Britain at 180%. Today, that would rank as moderate. We've entered completely uncharted territory with debt levels that dwarf anything in human history. The United States, the world's largest economy, carries 120% debt to GDP. But that's just federal debt. Add state, local, corporate, and household debt, and America's total obligations exceed 400% of economic output. Japan sits at 260% government debt alone. Italy at 150%. Greece briefly hit 200% before partial default. These aren't historical anomalies. They're the new normal, but raw percentages don't capture the true scale. Global debt has exploded from $40 trillion in 2000 to over $300 trillion today. That's more debt created in 25 years than in all of previous human history combined. To put this in perspective, global GDP is roughly $100 trillion. We've borrowed 3 times the planet's annual economic output. The mathematics are staggering and impossible. The United States alone pays over $1 trillion annually just servicing existing debt. That's more than the entire federal budget in 1987. And interest rates remain historically low. When rates normalize, debt service will consume 40% of federal revenue. Mathematical impossibility disguised as economic policy. China presents an even more dangerous scenario. Official government debt appears moderate at 70% of GDP, but local government obligations, state enterprise debt, and shadow banking push total Chinese debt over 300% of economic output. A bubble economy built entirely on credit that makes Japan's 1980s collapse look minor. Europe faces demographic collapse with unsustainable debt. Germany's aging population cannot fund promised pensions while servicing existing obligations. France's debt accelerates faster than economic growth. Southern European nations remain one crisis away from complete financial collapse despite multiple bailouts. Most critically, central bank balance sheets have exploded. The Federal Reserve holds $9 trillion in assets, mostly government debt that will never be repaid. The European Central Bank, Bank of Japan, and People's Bank of China have created tens of trillions from nothing, monetizing debt that would otherwise cause immediate default. These numbers aren't sustainable, and when debt becomes unsustainable, history shows us what happens next. The pattern holds regardless of scale. Whether it's 30% debt to GDP in 1914 or 300% today, the mathematics remain unchanged. You cannot borrow infinity. The conflicts are already beginning. What appears to be random geopolitical tensions are actually debt-driven resource competitions following the exact pattern that preceded both world wars. Nations with unsustainable debt levels are increasingly aggressive in securing assets, eliminating creditors, and positioning for the financial reset that history says must come. Russia's invasion of Ukraine isn't about NATO expansion or historical grievances. It's about debt elimination through territorial conquest. Russia entered 2022 with external debt of nearly $500 billion, while facing economic sanctions that made normal debt service impossible. War provides justification for repudiating obligations to hostile Western creditors while seizing Ukrainian agricultural natural and energy resources worth trillions. The United States response reveals identical motivations. America has provided over $200 billion in aid to Ukraine, money borrowed against future taxpayers who cannot possibly repay existing obligations. But Ukrainian victory eliminates Russia as a creditor nation while maintaining dollar dominance in energy markets. Debt mathematics disguised as humanitarian intervention. China's aggression toward Taiwan follows the same logic. China holds over $3 trillion in foreign reserves, mostly U.S. government debt that America cannot realistically repay. War with America would eliminate those obligations instantly, while providing access to Taiwan's semiconductor industry and Pacific shipping routes. Chinese military buildup isn't preparation for territorial expansion, it's preparation for debt elimination. Middle Eastern conflicts intensify as oil-dependent nations face impossible debt burdens with declining energy revenues. Saudi Arabia's debt has exploded from near zero to over $800 billion, while oil demand peaks. Yemen, Syria, and Iraq become proxy battlegrounds where major powers compete for resources needed to service unsustainable obligations. Trade wars escalate into currency wars as nations attempt to devalue their way out of debt burdens. The United States weaponizes the dollar's reserve currency status to force debt repayment, while China builds alternative payment systems to escape dollar-denominated obligations. Europe fractures as northern creditor nations demand austerity from southern debtor nations that cannot possibly comply. Most ominously, military spending accelerates globally despite unsustainable debt levels. World military expenditure exceeded $2.4 trillion in 2023, money borrowed from future generations who cannot repay existing obligations. Nations don't borrow to fund military expansion unless they plan to use those militaries to eliminate the debt. The warning signs aren't subtle, they're screaming. Resource competition, currency conflicts, military buildup, alliance fractures, trade wars escalating to economic warfare. Every indicator that preceded previous global conflicts is flashing red simultaneously. The only difference is scale. The conflicts are already beginning. The question is whether they'll escalate to the level history suggests they must. War isn't humanity's failure to solve economic problems peacefully. War is the solution. When debt reaches mathematically impossible levels, violence becomes the most efficient method to restructure obligations and reset the entire economic system. This isn't moral judgment, it's mathematical fact. And the mechanism works with brutal efficiency. First, war eliminates creditor nations through destruction. When Germany bombed London, British government bonds held by German institutions became worthless instantly. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, American investments in Japanese companies vanished overnight. Physical destruction of creditor nations eliminates their claims automatically. No negotiation required, no legal proceedings, just obliteration. Second, war provides moral justification for debt repudiation. Payments to enemy nations become treason rather than legal obligation. Russian debts to Western banks after February 2022 weren't defaulted. They were patriotically suspended due to hostile actions. What would normally be theft becomes national defense. Public opinion supports what economics cannot. Third, war enables total currency reset. New governments can issue new currencies backed by different assets or guarantees. The Weimar Republic's debts disappeared when the Reichsmark was replaced. Soviet obligations vanished when the ruble was restructured. Confederate bonds became worthless paper after 1865. War allows complete monetary system replacement without creditor consent. Fourth, war creates massive reconstruction demand that stimulates growth. Destroyed infrastructure must be rebuilt. Devastated industries must be restored. Dead populations must be replaced through immigration or reproduction incentives. This reconstruction spending, funded through new debt or confiscated enemy assets, generates the economic growth necessary to service remaining obligations. Fifth, war redistributes global wealth through conquest. German seizure of European gold reserves funded the Nazi war machine while eliminating creditor claims. Allied victory transferred Axis assets to winning nations. Resource-rich territories change hands, providing new revenue streams to service debt while eliminating obligations to displaced populations. Most importantly, war changes the fundamental debt equation by eliminating the creditors themselves. Dead lenders cannot demand repayment. Destroyed nations cannot enforce contracts. Conquered territories cannot maintain legal claims. The debt doesn't get repaid or forgiven. It simply ceases to exist because the institutions that created it no longer exist. This mechanism has worked throughout history because it addresses the core mathematical problem. You cannot borrow infinity, but you can eliminate the entities you borrowed from. War isn't the breakdown of civilization. War is how civilization resets itself when the economic mathematics become impossible. The mechanism is clear, the precedent is established. So what happens next? History doesn't repeat, but the mathematics mathematics are identical. Current global debt levels exceed those that triggered both world wars by factors that make predictions straightforward. The pattern says we're not approaching a debt crisis. We're in the terminal phase of one that began in 2008 and accelerated dramatically during the pandemic response. The timeline follows historical precedent with terrifying precision. Debt crisis emergence takes 10 to 15 years. We're now 17 years from the 2008 financial crisis that marked the beginning of unsustainable debt accumulation. Political extremism rises 8 to 12 years after crisis onset. Nationalist movements and authoritarian leaders now control or influence governments across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Military conflicts begin 12 to 18 years after initial crisis. We're seeing exactly that now. The trigger mechanisms are already active. Currency wars between dollar, yuan, and euro create increasing instability in international trade. Resource competition intensifies as climate change reduces agricultural output while debt service demands increase. Demographic collapse in developed nations makes existing pension and healthcare obligations mathematically impossible while reducing tax bases needed for debt service. Most critically, interest rate normalization makes current debt levels instantly unsustainable. The United States pays over $1 trillion annually servicing debt at historically low rates. If rates return to historical averages of 5 to 7%, debt service would consume the entire federal budget. No money for defense, social programs, or basic government operations. Mathematical impossibility that demands extraordinary solutions. China faces the most immediate pressure. Property sector collapse has eliminated $30 trillion in household wealth, while local governments owe another $50 trillion in hidden obligations. Chinese banks hold worthless assets exceeding annual GDP while facing massive deposit withdrawals. When China's financial system collapses, global trade seizes up and debt deflation accelerates worldwide. The conflict will likely begin in the Pacific as China moves to eliminate American creditor status while securing resources necessary for regime survival. Taiwan provides semiconductors essential for modern military technology while eliminating $3 trillion in American debt claims. Russian expansion continues in Eastern Europe for identical reasons. Middle Eastern oil producers face declining revenues with increasing debt service, making regional wars inevitable. Europe fractures first as northern creditor nations demand impossible austerity from southern debtor nations. Political systems collapse when populations realize their governments literally cannot pay promised benefits while servicing existing debt. Social unrest creates the conditions for authoritarian solutions and military action. The pattern predicts global conflict within 5 to 7 years, not because of political failures or cultural differences, but because the debt mathematics make peaceful resolution impossible. The storm isn't coming, it's here.